The first time Raymond Calloway watched a stranger hook a chain to his late wife's truck, he didn't say a word. He just stood there on the porch of 14 Magnolia Court, barefoot in a faded army t-shirt, holding a cup of black coffee that was slowly going cold. The tow truck driver wouldn't look him in the eye. The woman in the pearl-white Cadillac Escalade wouldn't stop smiling. And that 1967 Ford F-100, cherry red, hand-restored, the last piece of Evelyn's father that Ray had left in this world, groaned against the winch like something alive being dragged off to slaughter. Ray took a slow sip of his coffee. He watched the truck disappear down the street. Then he nodded just once and went back inside to make a phone call that would ruin 3 people's lives before sundown. You see, folks, that woman in the Escalade thought she had just taught an old man a lesson about who ran this neighborhood. She had no idea she'd just picked a fight with the man who built it. Let me tell you about Willow Creek Estates. It sits about 22 miles northwest of Charleston, South Carolina, tucked into the pine woods outside a little town called Somerville. 216 homes, 3 cul-de-sacs, 1 community pond with a wooden dock that somebody's kids had carved their initials into back in 1992, and nobody ever had the heart to sand away. In the summer of 2019, it was the kind of place where the sprinklers still came on at 6 a.m., where American flags hung from porch posts along Azalea Drive, and where the smell of freshly cut Bermuda grass drifted through open kitchen windows on Saturday mornings. You could hear the crack of a screen door 3 houses down. You could hear cicadas arguing in the magnolias. You could hear Mr. Delacroix at number 9 yelling at his Labrador to quit digging up the tomatoes. It was quiet, it was decent. It was the kind of neighborhood people moved to when they were done moving. And on a warm Tuesday morning in June of 2019, at 7:14 a.m., that quiet was about to be broken by the sound of a tow truck's air brakes hissing in front of 14 Magnolia Court. But to understand why that moment mattered, why it mattered more than anyone on that street could possibly have known, I have to tell you first about the man standing on that porch. His name was Master Sergeant Raymond Ray Calloway, United States Army, retired. He was 78 years old that summer. 6'1", though the shrapnel in his left hip from a rice paddy outside Pleiku in 1968 had bent him maybe an inch shorter than he used to stand. He wore his white hair cropped close, the way he'd worn it since basic training at Fort Polk in the spring of 1966. His hands were big and rough, stained permanently around the knuckles from 40 years of motor oil and wood stain. Ray had served 22 years in the Army. 2 tours in Vietnam with the 4th Infantry Division, 1967 and 1969. A Bronze Star with valor, a Purple Heart he never talked about. He finished out his career in the Corps of Engineers, building bridges and barracks and airstrips from Germany to Panama to a little spit of desert outside of Riyadh during the First Gulf War. He retired in 1988. And then he did something the Army never quite prepared him for. He came home. He came home to a little brick rambler in Somerville, South Carolina, that he and his wife Evelyn had bought with his re-enlistment bonus back in 1971. He came home, and he looked at the overgrown pine woods behind the house, 58 acres his daddy had left him when he died, and he thought, I could build something here. So he did. Evelyn Calloway passed away in the spring of 2016, a sweet, slow-moving cancer that gave them 11 months to say everything they needed to say. Ray buried her under the big magnolia out back, planted a little rose bush over her. And ever since, he'd lived alone at 14 Magnolia Court with a deaf old beagle named Petey and a garage full of tools and half-finished projects. He was a quiet man, a patient man, the kind of man who waved at every car that drove past, who fixed the mailbox when the teenagers knocked it over, who brought a casserole to the new folks at number 31 when their daddy passed. He wasn't weak, he'd just made his peace with not needing to prove that anymore. Or so he thought, right up until the morning somebody towed his truck. Let me tell you about Melissa Hargrove Pembroke. She'd moved into 22 Magnolia Court 11 months earlier, October of 2018. A pearl-white 2019 Cadillac Escalade with vanity plates that read MHP Queen. A husband named Todd who worked in what he called strategic real estate and what the IRS would later call securities fraud. 2 miniature poodles named Prada and Gucci. And a social media presence that included the phrase "low country lifestyle maven" in her Instagram bio. She was 44 years old, blonde hair blown out every Thursday at a salon in Mount Pleasant. She drove into Charleston 3 times a week for Pilates, and she had decided within approximately 6 days of moving into Willow Creek Estates that the neighborhood was beneath her standards. The grass was the wrong length, the mailboxes didn't match, the community pond had ducks in it. So Melissa Hargrove Pembroke did what women like Melissa Hargrove Pembroke do. She ran for HOA president. And in April of 2019, with exactly 11 signatures on a petition she'd circulated over white wine at a bunco night, she won the election unopposed because nobody else in Willow Creek had ever wanted the job. She was sworn in on April 14th. She started issuing violations on April 15th. By the end of May, she had written 127 formal notices. She had fined the Rodriguez family at number 8 for non-compliant shutter color. She had threatened to Leon the Henderson house at number 47 over a garden gnome. And she had told Mr. Delacroix, a 67-year-old Korean immigrant who lived on that street for 26 years, that his tomato plants were damaging the aesthetic continuity of the cul-de-sac. The first time Ray Calloway met her, she was standing in his driveway, clipboard in hand, pointing at that cherry-red 1967 Ford F-100. "Sir," she said without introducing herself, "that vehicle is in violation of Covenant 14.3. Hobby vehicles, project vehicles, and antique vehicles are not permitted to be stored in visible driveways." Ray blinked at her. He set down the garden hose he'd been holding. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "that's not a hobby vehicle, that's my truck. I drive it to church every Sunday." She gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Not anymore you don't," she said. And she turned on her heel and walked back to her Escalade. Now, Ray Calloway had been in the Army for 22 years. He had been yelled at by drill sergeants in Louisiana. He had been shot at by men in black pajamas in the Central Highlands. He had been dressed down by a one-star general in a hangar outside Kuwait City for a typo on a requisition form. Nothing had ever quite prepared him for being lectured about his own truck in his own driveway by a woman he'd never met. So he did what Ray always did. He tried to be reasonable. That afternoon, around 4 p.m., he walked the 3 houses down to 22 Magnolia Court. He was wearing a clean button-down shirt. He'd even tucked it in. He carried a small cardboard box that held 2 jars of the blackberry preserves he made every June from the bushes behind Evelyn's magnolia. He rang the doorbell. He waited. He rang it again. Melissa opened the door, looked him up and down, and said, "Yes." "Ma'am," Ray said, "I think we got off on the wrong foot this morning. My name's Ray Calloway. I live down at number 14. I brought you some preserves my wife used to make. I was hoping we could talk about the truck." She looked at the jars like he was handing her a dead animal. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I'm not interested in preserves. I'm interested in compliance. You have until Friday to remove that vehicle from your driveway, or it will be towed at your expense. Have a lovely evening." And then she said it, the line that would replay in Ray's head for the next 72 hours. She leaned forward slightly, she lowered her voice, and she said, "Listen, old man, this isn't your little army base anymore. We have standards here." Then she closed the door in his face. Ray stood on her porch for a long moment. The jars were still in his hands. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up. The sun was low and orange through the pines. He walked home. He set the jars on the kitchen counter. He sat down in his worn leather recliner, the one Evelyn had tried to throw out for 15 years, and he stared at the framed photograph on the wall across the room. A younger Ray, a crew of 7 men in fatigues, a half-built schoolhouse in a village called Bayan Hoa, 1968. He didn't say a word for about an hour. Direct hit. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to be reasonable with somebody who has no interest in being reasonable? Somebody who took your kindness and used it as proof that you were weak? Drop a comment down below and tell me about it, because I promise you, folks, you are not alone. Now let's get back to Ray. The next morning, Ray moved the truck into his garage. It was a tight fit. The F-100 was a big old beast, and Ray's garage was mostly full of woodworking tools and a workbench he'd built himself in 1978, but he squeezed it in. He closed the door. He figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. On Thursday, June 13th, he found a violation notice taped to his mailbox. Garage door observed open on 6/12 at 11:47. Visible storage of non-compliant vehicle from public right-of-way. Fine, $250. On Saturday, June 15th, somebody and nobody ever proved who dumped a bag of grass clippings over his back fence, right onto Evelyn's rose bush. Ray spent 2 hours picking it off, one blade at a time, his hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since 1969. On Monday, June 17th, a Dominion Energy truck showed up claiming they'd gotten a report of unpermitted electrical work at 14 Magnolia Court. Ray had to show them his garage, his breaker box, and his 40-year-old license from when he'd helped rewire half the original houses in the neighborhood back in the late 80s. On Wednesday, June 19th, Petey, his deaf old beagle, came limping home from his morning walk with a gash on his back leg. The vet said it looked like he'd been kicked. Ray didn't sleep that night. But here's what Melissa Hargrove Pembroke didn't know. Ray Calloway was documenting everything. He had 4 wireless 4K cameras mounted around his property. Cameras he'd installed 3 years earlier when kids had been knocking over mailboxes on Halloween. He had date-stamped photographs of every violation notice. He had a leather-bound notebook, the same kind he'd used for patrol logs in Vietnam, where he wrote down in small, neat handwriting every interaction, every incident, every time he saw that pearl-white Escalade slow down in front of his house. June 21st, Escalade drove by at 5:47, stopped for 90 seconds, drove away. June 22nd, Escalade drove by at 6:02, MHP observed photographing my mailbox. June 24th, found dog treats thrown over fence into Petey's run, bagged and saved for veterinary analysis. You see, folks, Ray Calloway had spent 22 years in the United States Army, and if the Army had taught him one thing, it was this: you don't win the fight you start, you win the fight you document. He kept his notebook in the top drawer of Evelyn's old writing desk, next to a manila folder, a very thick manila folder, a folder that had been sitting in that drawer undisturbed since 1989. That folder was about to matter. On the morning of Tuesday, June 25, 2019, at 7:14 a.m., Raymond Calloway stepped out onto his front porch with a cup of black coffee and watched a man named Dwight hook a chain to his wife's father's truck. Ray had moved the truck back into the driveway the night before, just for a few hours. He'd been planning to drive it to Charleston that morning to pick up a rebuilt carburetor from a specialty shop on King Street. He'd woken up at 5 a.m., made coffee, put on his boots. He'd come outside at 7:14 to find Melissa Hargrove Pembroke standing in his driveway in a pink workout set, holding her phone up, recording. "Mr. Calloway," she called out cheerfully, "as per Covenant 14.3, Section B, this vehicle is being impounded for repeated noncompliance. You'll find the paperwork in your mailbox." Ray didn't move. He looked at Dwight, the tow truck driver, a big man, maybe 50, who clearly did not want to be there. "Son," Ray said quietly, "that truck belonged to my wife's father. He gave it to her on their wedding day in 1967. She gave it to me the week before she died. There's a little dent in the tailgate where my granddaughter hit it with her bicycle when she was 9. If you take that truck, you are going to have to live with that for the rest of your life." Dwight looked at the ground, he looked at Melissa, he looked back at Ray. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "I got a court order I got to." Ray nodded. "All right, son," he said, "you do what you got to do." And he stepped back onto his porch. He watched the winch tighten, he watched the front wheels lift. He watched that cherry-red 1967 Ford F-100 Evelyn's truck slide up onto the flatbed like a body on a stretcher. He did not cry. Melissa lowered her phone, she walked over to the porch, she was still smiling. "I hope this has been educational, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about the kind of community you live in." Ray took a slow sip of his coffee. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been thinking about this community for 30 years. She laughed, a bright, dismissive, bell-like laugh. "Oh, honey," she said, "don't get sentimental on me." And she walked back to her Escalade. The tow truck pulled away at 7:21 a.m. Ray stood on his porch for another 4 minutes. The coffee went cold in his hand. A mourning dove called from the pine tree across the street. Somewhere down Azalea Drive, a screen door slammed. Then he went inside. He opened the top drawer of Evelyn's writing desk. He took out the manila folder. And he picked up the phone. Direct hit. If you think Ray Calloway is going to let this one go, you have never met a man like Ray Calloway. Stick with me, folks, because what comes next is the reason I make these videos. Now, here's what nobody in Willow Creek Estates knew about the quiet old man at 14 Magnolia Court. Ray Calloway didn't just live in Willow Creek. Ray Calloway built Willow Creek. Back in the spring of 1989, the year after he retired from the Army, Ray had taken those 58 acres his daddy left him. He'd partnered with a small community bank in Somerville, and he'd spent 4 years personally surveying, clearing, and developing every single lot in what would become Willow Creek Estates. He'd hired the road crew. He'd run the sewer lines. He'd planted the magnolias along Azalea Drive himself. And when the development was finished in 1993, Ray and his attorney, a Charleston lawyer named Wallace Pennington, had drafted the founding documents of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Every single word. That manila folder in Evelyn's desk drawer, that was the original signed charter. Ray had kept a copy. Attorney Pennington had kept a copy. And a third copy sat in a climate-controlled storage vault at the Dorchester County Courthouse, 2 miles from Melissa Hargrove Pembroke's Pilates studio. In that charter, buried on page 41, section 17.4, was a clause that Ray himself had insisted on back in 1993. It read, and I'm paraphrasing, folks, because these things are written in legalese, the founder member shall retain in perpetuity the right to convene an emergency review of any HOA action deemed to be in violation of the spirit or letter of the original covenants, and may, by written notice, suspend the sitting board pending independent audit. Ray Calloway was the founder member. He had never invoked the clause, not once in 26 years. Through 3 HOA presidents, a pond dredging dispute in 2004, a big fight over Christmas light timing in 2011, Ray had always stayed out of it. Let the neighbors govern themselves, that was the whole point. But on the morning of Tuesday, June 25, 2019, at 7:34 a.m., Raymond Calloway sat down at Evelyn's writing desk, took out a piece of letterhead, and in his small, neat handwriting, invoked Section 17.4 for the first time in the history of Willow Creek Estates. He called Wallace Pennington, 71 years old now, still practicing law part-time out of a brick office on Broad Street. Wally, Ray said, "It's Ray Calloway." "Well, I'll be damned," Wallace said. "What's the occasion?" "Wally," Ray said, "I need you to pull the charter, section 17.4, I'm invoking it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ray," Wallace said carefully, "are you sure?" "Wally," Ray said, "she took Evelyn's truck." Another silence. "I'll be there in 2 hours," Wallace said. Ray hung up the phone. Then he called his old friend Colonel Marcus Reyes, U.S. Army, retired, Judge Advocate General's Corps, now a senior partner at a litigation firm in Charleston. They'd served together in Panama in 1984. Marcus owed Ray his life from a night outside Cologne that neither of them talked about anymore. "Ray," Marcus said when he picked up, "it's been a while, brother." "Marcus," Ray said, "I need a favor." "Name it." "I need a forensic audit of an HOA's financial records going back 18 months. I need it by Friday, and I need a civil complaint drafted for unlawful conversion of personal property." Marcus paused. "Ray," he said, "what's the property?" "Evelyn's truck." Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said, "with 3 associates and a process server." Ray hung up the phone. He sat in Evelyn's chair. He looked out the window at the rose bush in the backyard. The first pink blooms of summer were just starting to open. "Evie," he said quietly, "I'm sorry, honey, but I think we're going to have to get loud for a minute." The morning of Friday, June 28, 2019, dawned hot and gray over Summerville, South Carolina. The air smelled like cut grass and approaching rain. A low bank of storm clouds sat over the Ashley River, moving slow toward the coast. At 8:47 a.m., a line of vehicles turned onto Magnolia Court from Azalea Drive. There was a black Lincoln Town Car, Wallace Pennington behind the wheel, gray suit, silver hair, looking like a man about to deliver a sermon. There was a navy blue BMW sedan, Colonel Marcus Ray's, JAG Corps retired, now senior partner at Ray's and Whitfield, along with two associates in matching charcoal suits. There was a Dorchester County Sheriff's deputy in a cruiser, invited as a courtesy to keep the peace. There was a process server in a brown Ford Taurus. And rolling slowly behind them at the back of the procession was a flatbed tow truck driven by a man named Dwight, who, as it turned out, had been very cooperative with the investigation once he understood what he'd gotten mixed up in. On the flatbed, secured with brand new straps, washed and waxed and returned at the expense of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, a cherry red 1967 Ford F-100. The convoy stopped in front of 22 Magnolia Court at 8:53 a.m. Ray Calloway was on his porch. He was drinking coffee. He did not walk down to meet them. Melissa Hargrove Pembroke opened her front door at 8:54 a.m. She was wearing a pink silk bathrobe. She was holding a latte. Her hair was in a silk wrap. She squinted at the line of vehicles in front of her house. "What," she said, "is going on?" Wallace Pennington climbed out of the Lincoln. He was carrying a leather briefcase. He walked up her front walk at the unhurried pace of a man who had been practicing law for 46 years. "Mrs. Hargrove Pembroke," he said politely, "my name is Wallace Pennington. I represent the founder member of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I have several documents to deliver to you this morning." He opened the briefcase. "First," he said, "notice of suspension from the office of HOA president, effective immediately, pursuant to Section 17.4 of the original charter." He handed her the paper. "Second, notice of independent forensic audit of all HOA financial records from the period January 2018 through June 2019. Initial findings suggest approximately $73,400 in unaccounted for withdrawals from the association's operating account, most of which appear to have been deposited into a personal account registered to a Melissa Hargrove Pembroke." He handed her the second paper. Her latte was shaking. "Third," Wallace continued, "notice of civil action filed this morning in Dorchester County Superior Court. Calloway versus Hargrove Pembroke, et al. Causes of action include unlawful conversion of personal property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, abuse of process, and as of 8:15 this morning, a referral to the South Carolina Attorney General's Office for possible criminal investigation regarding the misappropriation of association funds." He handed her the third paper. "Damages sought," he said, "total $847,000. Melissa's mouth opened. No sound came out. "Fourth," Wallace said, "a cease and desist order prohibiting any further retaliatory contact with Mr. Calloway or his property." "And fifth." The process server stepped forward. "You've been served." The sheriff's deputy tipped his hat politely. Dwight, the tow truck driver, quietly unloaded the cherry red Ford F-100 and parked it in Ray's driveway, exactly where it had been 4 days earlier. Melissa Hargrove Pembroke stood on her front porch in a pink silk bathrobe with a latte in her shaking hand and 4 separate legal documents spreading across her bare feet. You can't," she said. He's just an old man." Wallace Pennington smiled, a small, polite, devastating smile. "Ma'am," he said, "that old man drew the lot your house sits on with a transit and a plumb bob in 1992. His name is on page 1 of every founding document of this association. You have been, for the last 11 weeks, an elected officer of a corporation that he owns." He closed his briefcase. "Have a lovely morning," he said. And he walked back to his Lincoln. Across the street at 14 Magnolia Court, Ray Calloway was still on his porch. He was still drinking coffee. He did not turn his head. The next 20 minutes on Magnolia Court were the quietest 20 minutes that street had ever known. Front doors opened one by one up and down the cul-de-sac. Mr. Delacroix at number 9 stepped out in his bathrobe, holding a garden trowel, his Labrador at his feet. The Rodriguezes at number 8 came out onto their porch, both of them and their 2 kids, all of them silent. The Hendersons at number 47 walked all the way down to the corner just to see. Old Mrs. Whittaker at number 3, who hadn't left her house except for church and groceries in 6 years, stood in her doorway in slippers and a housecoat with tears running down her cheeks. Nobody said a word. Nobody had to. They just watched. They watched Melissa Hargrove Pembroke stand on her porch in that pink bathrobe, papers scattered around her feet, her latte forgotten on the railing. They watched her husband Todd come out behind her, confused, pulling on a polo shirt, asking what was happening. They watched her try to explain and fail and sit down hard on her front steps and finally start to cry. They watched the convoy of lawyers pull away. They watched Ray Calloway finish his coffee, nod slowly to himself, and walk back inside his house. And then slowly, without anyone planning it, they all walked down to 14 Magnolia Court. Mr. Delacroix brought tomatoes from his garden. Mrs. Rodriguez brought a pan of pastelitos still warm from the oven. The Henderson kids brought a little hand-drawn card that read, "Thank you, Mr. Ray," in crayon. Mrs. Whittaker just brought herself, which was more than she'd brought anywhere in a long time. Ray opened the door and blinked at the crowd on his porch. "Well," he said slowly, "this is a lot of people." Mrs. Whittaker reached up, she was barely 5 feet tall, and put both her hands on his face. "Raymond Calloway," she said, "you quiet, stubborn, magnificent old man." And Ray Calloway, a man who had not cried at his own wife's funeral, a man who had not cried at his mother's funeral, a man who had not cried since a rice paddy outside Pleiku in October of 1968, Ray Calloway stood in his doorway and did something he had forgotten he could still do. He laughed. A big, rolling, open-chested laugh, like something breaking loose in his ribs. And the whole street laughed with him. Melissa Hargrove Pembroke and her husband Todd moved out of 22 Magnolia Court on September 11, 2019. The civil suit settled for $312,000 in damages, plus the return of every dollar she had embezzled from the HOA, plus 12 months of unpaid legal fees for Wallace Pennington. Todd Pembroke, whose strategic real estate business had been under quiet federal scrutiny for almost 2 years, was indicted in November on 6 counts of securities fraud. He pled guilty in March of 2020 and served 32 months at a federal facility in Butner, North Carolina. Melissa filed for divorce from prison visitor parking, if you can believe that. She moved back in with her mother in Boca Raton. Her Instagram account went private. The Cadillac Escalade was repossessed. Nobody on Magnolia Court ever heard from her again. Ray Calloway went on being Ray Calloway. He kept driving Evelyn's 1967 Ford F-100 to church every Sunday. He fixed the dent on the tailgate, finally, though he kept a photograph of it just to remember. He quietly dissolved the old HOA in the winter of 2019 and helped the neighborhood write a new set of covenants, 3 pages instead of 97, and he made Mrs. Whittaker the first new president because he said she was the only person on the street with the good sense to leave people alone. Petey, the deaf old beagle, passed peacefully in the fall of 2021, curled up on his blanket under the magnolia tree where Evelyn was buried. The rose bush over Evelyn's grave bloomed bigger every summer. And in the spring of 2023, a young couple moved into 22 Magnolia Court, a firefighter named Jacob and a pediatric nurse named Anna, with a newborn baby and a rescued German shepherd, and absolutely no intention of running for HOA president. They brought Ray a loaf of banana bread the day they moved in. Ray brought them 2 jars of blackberry preserves in return, made from the bushes behind Evelyn's magnolia, from a recipe he'd been making since 1973. Jacob and Anna named their baby daughter Evelyn. They didn't know, Ray never told them. But he smiled every time he heard them call her name across the yard. You see, folks, there is a lesson in this story, and I want you to sit with it for a minute. We live in a world right now where too many people mistake a quiet man for a weak man, where they look at gray hair and a slow walk and a soft voice and they think, that one I can push around, that one won't fight back. But I want you to remember something. Quiet is not the same as empty. Patience is not the same as permission, and a man who has spent a lifetime controlling his temper is not a man without one. He is a man who has learned, the hard way, exactly how much damage his temper can do and exactly when it is worth unleashing. Ray Calloway spent 22 years in the United States Army. He spent another 26 years quietly watching over a neighborhood he built with his own 2 hands. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten, he did not throw a single punch. He just waited and he documented. And when the moment came, he made one phone call to a man he'd served with in Panama in 1984, and he ended the fight before the other side even knew it had started. So if you take one thing away from this story tonight, let it be this. Be kind to your old neighbors, folks. You never know which one of them built the street you're standing on. And you never, ever want to find out the hard way. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak man. Never mistake patience for permission. And never ever pick a fight with a veteran who has nothing left to lose but his honor. God bless Ray Calloway, God bless Evelyn's Rose Bush, and God bless every one of you watching tonight. I'll see you in the next story.